Good morning. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on our heritage.org website on all of these occasions, and welcome your comments or questions at any time. You can simply email us at speaker@heritage.org. And for those in-house, if you'll be so kind to check that your cell phones have been turned off as we prepare to begin, it's always appreciated. Pleased to have my friend Peter Schweizer back with us today here at Heritage. Peter currently is president of the Government Accountability Institute, a nonprofit research institution dedicated to investigating cronyism, government corruption, and misuse of taxpayer money. In other words, you have no question of job security. He is also the William J. Casey Fellow at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. He is the author or co-author of more than a dozen books on policy, government, and culture. His previous book, Throw Them All Out, dealt with the issue of congressional insider trading, and as most know, is widely credited with leading to the passage of the Stock Act. Among his other books are The Bushes, Portrait of a Dynasty, Reagan's War, the epic story of his 40-year struggle and final triumph over communism, and Do As I Say, Not As I Do, Profiles in Liberal Hypocrisy. Additionally, he was executive producer of In the Face of Evil, an epic documentary based on his Reagan's War book, which won the 2004 Liberty Film Festival Award. Today, we focus on his newest book, Extortion, as the subtitle fully explains, how politicians extract your money, buy votes, and line their own pockets. Please join me in welcoming Peter back to Heritage. Peter?
Great, thank you. Thank you, John. It's great to be back, and John, thank you again for making me feel so warm here at Heritage. I'm going to contend to you today that we have a problem in American politics that's overlooked, and the problem is that the ghost of Jimmy Stewart is haunting American politics. Now, you might think this time of the year, maybe I'm talking about something related to the film It's a Wonderful Life, but I'm going to actually ask you to look at another one of his films. That's Mr. Smith Goes to Washington. I assume everybody here has seen it or is familiar with the storyline. It's a wonderful story of sort of an idealistic a guy who comes to Washington, D.C., who essentially is trying to fight being corrupted. And that, I think, is sort of the mindset that we have adopted as it relates to money in politics over the last 40 years. Pretty much the assumption has been that politicians that get elected are idealistic, and if we can just sort of keep special interests and money politics and lobbyists at bay, everything will be good as these idealistic individuals lead us. Certainly that is the case in some instances. We have some idealistic people here who are trying to be good. They're interested in public service. But I would contend to you that the problem oftentimes is sort of the reverse. The problem is not that we have sort of idealistic, civic-minded politicians who might be corrupted by outside influences. I would contend to you that an equal problem is that we have people in elected office who, recognizing their position in power, are looking to exploit it. That the problem is not so much one of bribery, in that outsiders are trying to corrupt or bribe their way into influence, but rather it's politicians who are, in a sense, extorting individuals because of their position in power. Think about it this way. We have in Washington, D.C., an influence marketplace. There's a lot at stake. What the federal government does, because of its size and scope, can have an enormous influence over the success or failure of industries or businesses. In that influence marketplace, our focus and preoccupation has been on identifying and looking at the buyers of influence, whether that's labor unions or corporations. I'm going to contend to you and discuss a little bit today why I think we need to focus on the sellers of influence, which is primarily the politicians. Now, the conventional wisdom is that money is destroying politics, but I'm going to ask you to consider that perhaps politics is destroying money. That, in other words, the problem that we have today is that because of the size and scope of the federal government, it is compelling individuals, industries, and businesses to become engaged in the political process, even if they're not particularly interested in doing so. As a former chief operating officer of Microsoft told me in an interview, you may not be interested in Washington, D.C., but Washington, D.C. is definitely interested in you. And they come up with all sorts of techniques to ensure that that is the case. So let me just talk to you a little bit about what I think the information shows us and that is often overlooked about the role of money in politics. First of all, there have been surveys that have done that show pretty convincingly in my mind that when you look at corporations and you look at entrepreneurs, the majority of them report in surveys that the main reason that they make political contributions is because they fear that if they don't, bad things will happen to them or to their company. In other words, there are those, of course, who are giving out of idealistic notions. They believe in the policy positions that politicians are taking. They believe in, let's say, limited government or strong national defense or issues related to the environment, and they give out of that cause. But actually, the majority of companies and the majority of executives are giving not out of commitment to certain political philosophy, but because they are fearful that if they don't, bad things are going to happen. Now, how does that work? What does that look like? I recount numerous examples in the book. Let me just give you one that was given to me by a former president of Shell Oil, where in 2009 he went before a congressional committee to testify. You might remember the gasoline prices were quite high, and there was a lot of finger pointing as to who was responsible for high gas prices. As he sat before that congressional committee, he got lambasted by individuals from both political parties, basically saying that Shell and large oil companies were responsible for high gas prices. Well, set aside for a minute the debate on whether that's a legitimate charge or not. I think the marketplace determines that more than large corporations like Shell. But set that aside for a second and recount what happened. And you can find this actually on YouTube, at least the first part of it. During those hearings, Congresswoman Maxine Waters from California threatened that if Shell did not change its policies, that maybe it should be nationalized, that we should do to Shell what was done to oil companies in Venezuela. And there was a strong exchange between the president of Shell Oil and Maxine Waters, and you can see that spirited exchange on YouTube. But what happened after that hearing, I think, was very, very troubling. And this was not recorded on YouTube, but it was recounted to me. After that hearing, those same executives who were being lambasted by congressmen were approached by those congressmen who told them, you know, if you hold a fundraiser for me or donate to my campaign, I might understand your issues better. Now think about this from the standpoint of being a corporate executive. You have a responsibility to shareholders, to the bottom line, to preserving the integrity of the company, and you're essentially being told by individuals who can make life very difficult for your company, I will understand your issues better if you donate or hold a fundraiser for my campaign. What are you going to do? You're going to do what a lot of large corporations do in America, and that is you give to both sides. You oftentimes give to both candidates in a particular race because you've learned that to be on the bad side of a politician is not a good place to be. And that's really a function of the fact that members of Congress are far more powerful now than they were 100 years ago, because the size and scope of the government to make or break companies is much greater than it was 100 years ago. Now, the scenario or the story that I just outlined for you as it related to the oil companies has been repeated to me by many other individuals and corporate executives, some of whom I quote in the book, in different sectors of the economy. I had individuals from Goldman Sachs and others tell me that when they were equally lambasted in 2009 by Senate Banking Committee and others at hearings for what I would contend were some pretty ridiculous leveraged trades made by those Wall Street firms, after those hearings, the blackberries came out and the senators wanted to know when these individuals were going to raise money for them. And it was very, very clear that if you said no or you didn't cooperate, you weren't going to get help or a favorable hearing or even a kind word from those politicians. Now, what does that exchange look like? We might look at that exchange and say, well, that's just sort of, business as usual. That's the way politics is done in Washington. But I would contend to you that frankly, that sort of behavior in the private sector would be regarded as extortive behavior. And let me give you an analogy, something that is from the history books 20 to 30 years ago. I certainly remember this. Maybe there are others in the audience that do it well. There was a problem in large cities in the United States and in Canada 20, 30 years ago. They called them the squeegee men. Now, I don't know if you remember the squeegee men, but these were individuals who would come up to you at an intersection in a large city, and they would have a squeegee or a cloth in one hand and a brick in the other. And as the stoplight turned red, they would come up to your windshield and say, hey, I'll wash your windshield for $5. Well, if you're sitting in the car and there's a gentleman there with a cloth in one hand and a brick in the other, what are you going to do? You're going to give him $5. He's going to rub your windshield for about 2 seconds, and you're going to wait till the light turns green, and you're going to leave. Because you know that if you turn him down, odds are that brick is probably going to go through your windshield. Now, did the squeegee men ever say that they were going to throw that brick through the windshield? No, they did not. They didn't have to. Everybody knew that by the very presence of that brick, that this was a threat or an extorted behavior. And people like Rudy Giuliani and others dealt with this issue by making sure that it would not be tolerated because they saw it for what it was. I would contend to you that what happens to a lot of businesses and a lot of industries in Washington, D.C. is akin to facing a squeegee man. Now, the politician certainly dresses nicer. This transaction does not take place on a street corner. It takes place in maybe a restaurant or a building near the U.S. Capitol. But the transaction is very similar. And that is that if you expect to get any kind of responsive or favorable treatment, not even in terms of legislation, but just a meeting, you are expected to pony up and pay money. And if you don't, bad things are going to happen to you. So I would contend to you that what we deal with a lot of times on these issues is what I would consider a sort of form of legal extortion. Now, I give you a very basic example involving congressional hearings, but there are numerous other techniques that emerge and that are used all the time. Let me just talk about a couple of them to give you a sense of the sorts of issues we're talking about. The first one is what sometimes is called a milker bill. Now, a milker bill has absolutely nothing to do with the dairy industry. It has nothing to do with cows. A milker bill is a bill that is not really designed to pass. It's a bill that is introduced by members of Congress, sometimes with the collaboration or support of lobbyists, and the purpose of this bill is to basically scare the crap out of an industry or a company. And the reason you want to do that is by scaring them such, it's going to lead to a flow of contributions, and it's going to lead to lobbying gigs and contracts for friends or family members who happen to be lobbyists. So, for example, if you are a member of Congress, you introduce a bill that says we're going to slap a 25% excess profits tax on the energy industry. What's going to happen when that bill gets introduced? The first thing it's going to do is scare the daylights out of the energy industry. And they're going to go to that person who is sponsoring that bill or the co-sponsor of that bill, and they're going to say, hey, wait a second, what's going on here? Why are you doing this? This is going to hurt our industry. It's going to hurt the economy. And then the transaction or the dance, akin again to the squeegee man, is going to begin. And the expectation is that the company is going to have to make campaign contributions, perhaps raise money, perhaps make donations to charities that are affiliated to the politicians, perhaps hire family members who happen to be registered lobbyists. And I highlight numerous examples of this in the book. Once that has been done sufficiently to where the politician is satisfied, the bill will be withdrawn or the bill won't face any further action. But alas, the bill may reemerge again next year. Because you see, extortion, it's kind of like an annuity. You can go back to it and expect an income stream from it year after year after year. And I would contend that this is one of the reasons you see so many bills introduced that really there's not a great expectation that they're going to pass, but they are introduced to invoke a certain amount of fear among industries or individuals that will prompt them to take action and to let the transaction begin. There's another way in which sort of the milker bill works, and that relates to something in D.C. called tax extenders. I don't know who here is familiar with tax extenders. John's laughing, so he certainly is familiar with this. These are certain tax credits, and some I think are more legitimate than others, but tax credits that are afforded to companies relating to certain expenses. So let me give you a classic one that really has strong bipartisan support in the United States, and that's the R&D tax credit, which basically gives American corporations a tax benefit for making deep investments into research and development, something that everybody recognizes is good for the innovation of the American economy. Now, this R&D tax credit first appeared in 1981. Now, everybody thinks it's a great idea, so you would think, from the standpoint of policy and predictability and helping American corporations remain competitive, that this tax credit would be made permanent, right? Well, from a policy standpoint, that makes sense, but from an extortion standpoint, you're not paying attention. Because you see, if you pass it and make it permanent, you can't go back to companies like Microsoft and Google and other high-tech companies year after year after year and milk them for lobbying contracts and contributions. There's no reason for them to do that anymore. So what's happened with the tax credit, it has been upgraded since 1981. It has been passed again more than 18 times. They pass it to where it applies for a couple of years, then lo and behold, it looks like it's going to go into the night and no longer be applicable to companies. Companies panic, they go to politicians, they make the contributions, they hire the family members who are lobbyists. The bill is extended for 2 years, and then lo and behold, the process begins all over again. So what I would contend is when we look at legislative activity, organizations like Heritage do a fantastic job at looking at the policy implications of those bills, and that is crucial because that is what most directly affects us. I would contend that what we also need to try to do is look at the economics behind why bills are being introduced and why they're not being introduced. And the bottom line is that, unfortunately, I would contend a lot of the economic and financial incentives for people on the Hill are not to necessarily solve problems or to make good policy choices. It's to create a certain sense of chaos and a certain sense of unpredictability because that creates opportunities for generating revenue. So there's an example, one, the Milker bill. The second example that I would give is what is called the toll booth. Now, anybody here that has gone on the New Jersey Turnpike is familiar with paying the toll. You know, you're driving on the highway, you're using the road, and lo and behold, you come to a point where you either exit or on the main turnpike itself where you need to pay for the use of the road. And that, I think, makes sense. The people that use it ought to pay for it. America's legislative process isn't really supposed to function that way, but it oftentimes does. And let me explain to you how the toll booth works. You have a piece of legislation that both sides think is generally a good idea. This happened, say, in 2011, where there was a Wireless Freedom Tax Act that had bipartisan support. And this law was very, very simple. This bill said that local municipalities were not going to be able to put special taxes on cell phones. A lot of cities were facing revenue problems. Some of them were looking at adding special taxes onto cell phones. This would be absolute chaotic disaster for the cell phone industry. You can imagine trying to collect these taxes. Democrats and Republicans alike, liberals and conservatives said, yeah, we're going to put a 5-year moratorium on this. We can't have all these local taxes on cell phones. So the bill was introduced. It passed out of committee. There was little opposition. Then it was a question of it being scheduled for a vote on the full House floor. Well, they waited, and they waited, and they waited. And of course, there are all sorts of legislative activities taking place in Washington, D.C., but there was no vote scheduled for the full House floor. Well, lo and behold, AT&T and other corporations decided, some would have you believe just spontaneously, to send 35 checks on a single day to the Speaker of the House. That was done, and miraculously the next day the vote was held on the full House floor and the bill passed without any opposition. Now, I say this not to single out an individual. This is the way the process has worked for a while. Both sides have done it. But the simple fact is that to get attention in Washington, D.C., to get a powerful committee chairman or to get a leadership to act on a bill that you want, you are sometimes going to have to pay up. You're going to have to pay a toll. And just like in acting, in politics, timing is very important when it comes to giving money. And so the toll booth is very simply a method that says, yes, we have this legislative process, we have this legislative superhighway, but if you want it to pass further, you know, you're going to have to pay a toll. And that is sort of the technique of the toll booth, and it's very, very lucrative. So what I would ask you to consider then today is to look at what happens as it relates to money in politics, and not think of it just in terms of special interests, whether it be labor unions or corporations trying to get special deals, crony capitalism and set-asides. That certainly does happen. I would ask you to consider that sometimes the opposite takes place, and that is that corporations or industries are identified by politicians as being wealthy, having lots of assets, not being sufficiently active in the political sphere, so creating conditions whereby they are basically forced to do so. Let me now talk about the second component that I think is important about extortion. Then I would love to take some questions and thoughts that you might have on it. And that is to get us to think a little bit differently about what is the role of money in politics. Now, why do politicians raise money? Some estimates are that the average member of Congress is spending 70% of their time raising money. The conventional answer is that, well, that's how you win election. That's how you win re-election. And that is certainly an important component of it. But politics and money in politics has morphed or transformed over the last 30 years to where it represents something far more than that. And let me just sort of give you one example or one illustration, and that would be Senator Harry Reid, the majority leader from Nevada, who's been in politics for a long time. Senator Harry Reid does certainly have his Friends of Harry Reid, which is his traditional campaign committee that we're all so familiar about. But Harry Reid also has something called a leadership PAC. He has 3 joint fundraising committees. And when his son ran for governor of Nevada and he lost, they actually set up more than 90 political action committees that were funneling money to his re-election bid. So what I would contend to you is that it's no longer just a question of a politician raising money for their re-election committee. It has transformed into a broader industry where a politician no longer just has one pocket where they're going to deposit a check. They now can have 3, 4, 5, or 6 different pockets. So the amount of money that can be extracted from a corporation, from their political action committee, or from a corporate executive is not simply the money that goes to the re-election. It can go to the leadership PAC, the joint funding raising committees, you name it. But there's also a second important component that I think is often overlooked as well, and that is that the money that is raised is no longer just a question of going for re-election. That political classes figure out ways to transform those donations into what I call a lifestyle subsidy. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, if you have your campaign committee, say Friends of Jesse Jackson Jr., and you raise money, as he did, and then you use money from your re-election committee on personal things, like decorating your home, you will go to jail. And that's what has happened to Jesse Jackson Jr., and it's happened to other politicians. The Federal Election Commission has very strict rules and requirements on what you can use your re-election committee money for. But if you have a leadership PAC or if you have a joint fundraising committee, those rules are far looser. In the case of leadership PACs, there are basically no restrictions at all. So one of the things that happens is that money is raised for leadership PACs, and leadership PACs are used essentially as slush funds by politicians. There are some leadership PACs that are very legitimate and serve their function, which is to help get people from your political party elected to other offices. But there are far too many instances where politicians are using leadership PACs as slush funds. Let me just give you a couple of examples of that. Congressman Andrews from New Jersey raised money from his leadership PAC. He decided to spend $16,000 of that to take his family to Scotland. They stayed at a wonderful resort. They flew on a nice airline. His explanation or rationale was that one of the people in the wedding party was somebody that he kind of sort of was thinking about maybe hiring at some point. He couldn't have the guy obviously meet him in Washington, so he flew to Edinburgh, Scotland, and stayed in a nice resort in order to consort with him. And he brought his family along for good measure. That's just one example. There are numerous others. We found examples, and there was a special that we did on 60 Minutes about 3 or 4 weeks ago that looked at leadership PACs and looked at where this money ends up. If you like playing golf, You can use leadership PAC money to pay for your caddy fees, to pay for the greens fees, to go to the best golfing resorts in the world. And members of Congress do that. If you like a limousine service, if you like renting a yacht, you can use it for those purposes as well. We even found one, this was my personal favorite, a congressman from Minnesota who had spent $800 on cigars, which he regarded as office supplies, which I thought was an excellent idea. But seriously, there are no restrictions on how these funds are spent. Here's even the better part of it. If you are a member of Congress or a senator and you retire and you have money in your leadership PAC, you can transform that into personal cash. You have to pay income taxes on it, but you can literally convert that to personal cash. Probably a better move from a tax planning standpoint is to just simply keep it in the leadership PAC and use it for personal expenses, which takes place as well. So this, to me, is a very important component to what we're talking about, because the issue of money in politics is not just a function of election and re-election. It's also a function of a lifestyle subsidy. Members of the political class can live larger than they ordinarily would, because they are able to raise money. And when it comes to leadership PACs, much of that money comes from political action committees, from corporations, labor unions, or from lobbyists. So it's very, very much an insider's game. Let me finally mention an additional component to how this self-enrichment can take place as part of this extortive process. And really, this one, I think you have to give credit for the creativity that our politicians show. And it basically works like this, and I'll give you one stark example. There are about 15 members, other members of Congress that do this, and it's completely legal. Congresswoman Napolitano from Los Angeles decided in 1998 that she wanted to run for Congress. So she loaned her campaign $150,000. She decided that it was fair if her campaign would pay her 18% interest on that loan, and she decided she was going to wait more than 20 years to have the campaign actually pay off that loan. What that means, in effect, is that she was able to pocket personally more than $300,000 in interest payments that came from her campaign as form of interest for paying off this loan. You see how that works? In other words, it's a way in which you can turn your campaign and a loan to your campaign into a very consistent revenue stream. So these are the sorts of things that are going on. Now, let me just talk briefly about solutions, and then I'd love to get questions and comments and a discussion on that. People often say to me, you must be terribly depressed. It's awful to sort of deal with this stuff all the time. I'm actually an optimist by nature, which I'm sure people find puzzling, but I think there's grounds for it. A couple of solutions and things that I've proposed. First of all, I think as often is the case, we can look to the states for a very, very interesting idea. It would be transformative to Washington, I think, in a very, very good way. But consider this for a second. In 27 states in the United States, including the state of Florida where I live, the state of Texas, Washington State, and others, they have a very simple rule, a very simple regulation when it comes to money in politics, and it's a regulation of politicians. In those states, the law says that when the state legislature is in session, politicians cannot solicit or receive campaign contributions, period. Now, it's not a perfect law, but in Florida and other states, they will tell you that sort of the extortive stuff that's going on, the milker bills and the toll booth, has really, really been diminished, because you don't have that immediacy, that threat of some sort of legislative action that is going to spur or force somebody to have to make a donation. Imagine if we did that in Washington, D.C. Think about that for a second. If we said that members of Congress could not solicit or receive campaign contributions while Congress is in session. Because you know what happens right now is, as there is business being debated, whether it's a committee vote that is expected the next day or action on the House floor, members are literally getting on their cell phones, walking across the street, and shaking down people for campaign contributions. That's how the process takes place, and it's systematic and it's widespread. Were we to enact what 27 states had and apply to Washington, D.C., I think a couple of things would happen. Number one, the extortive behavior would decline dramatically. It wouldn't go away. These are very creative, ambitious people that are in politics. So they're always going to try to figure out ways around rules and restrictions. But I think it would reduce it. Number two, I think, and perhaps most crucially, it would force members of Congress to be far more effective and useful with their time, if for no other reason because they want Congress to be out of session so they can go and raise money. So in other words, you're incentivizing them to be efficient and effective. There are several members of Congress that I have talked to since the book that has come out that have told me and confirmed what I believe and what I think a lot of people here believe in. That is, there's a lot of wasted time in Congress. They drag things out on purpose. Because when you drag things out, again, you create more opportunities for extraction, more opportunities for self-enrichment, and it allows you to sort of adopt this model that has been so lucrative for so many people. So I think it would, at a minimum, force them to be far more efficient so that when Congress is in session, they're actually dealing with substantive issues and they're actually trying to focus on things like, say, the budget, rather than a lot of the milker bills or a lot of the other games that they play. So with that, I would love to open it up for questions and comments or thoughts and take it from there. Thank you, John. Thank you.
We'll take the question in the back, but I want to ask one first because some of my colleagues here will point out that Heritage has for years campaigned against restrictions on campaign financing.
Yep.
So if you do any kind of restriction, as much as I like the aspect of not during session, Tennessee, Virginia, or other states that do that, where do we get into our goal of individual freedom versus? Absolutely.
No, that's an absolutely crucial point. I'm a big believer in the First Amendment, and I'm a big believer in the Supreme Court, which has ruled since the Buckley decision and more recently in Citizens United. That is a First Amendment issue, and that's why I think the crucial point that we need to adopt is that if we believe that there is a problem with this corruption and this cronyism in Washington, the restriction should be on the politician. It should not be on the individual. And a friend of mine who was for years a regulator in the financial markets said, it's really unusual because any other market, the insurance market, the financial services market, almost all of the regulations are on the seller, not on the buyer. Except in the political influence market. Almost all the restrictions are on the buyers, not the sellers. And that's, of course, because in this case, the sellers, the politicians, get to write the rules. So absolutely, I agree with you that it is an individual freedom issue, that people giving money to political campaigns is a First Amendment right, and I support it. I think that the restriction and the focus ought to be on what politicians are doing and their ability to extract money, not on the restrictions on individuals to give.
Thank you for your indulgence.
Yes.
Just wait for the microphone, please.
Thank you. To follow up on that, then, how could you possibly eliminate all the evils that you've been talking about without reversing Citizens United and even going further? Because what difference does it make whether the politician solicits the contribution or the regulated company quote, voluntarily makes it? Either way, you've got to stop the whole process. You can't stop it halfway. So how do you reconcile your, I guess, support of Citizens United with eliminating all the evils that you've just been talking about?
Well, I think they're apples and oranges, and I would contend that there is a crucial difference between an individual, let's say, that lives in California who has strong feelings about the environment or strong feelings about gun control. I think there's a crucial difference if that individual is giving to a candidate for that reason and somebody who is being approached by a politician who says, look, if you want to come and talk to me about something, you're going to need to make a donation. I think there is a huge difference. And I think that is, when you look at the transaction, the scenario I gave of the squeegee man, it is crucially important. Is that a sort of voluntarily, freely made exchange where the person in the car is saying, yeah, I'd like to have my window washed, Or is that person doing it because they are fearful that something is going to happen? So I think there is a crucial difference. And let me just say one more thing, and then you can respond. I also think Citizens United is different as well in what we're talking about, because I would draw a big difference between individuals who, let's say, are taking out ads saying, I believe in a strong environment, and they want to take out TV ads on that issue. That, to me, is very different than individuals who are writing checks to specific politicians that are making decisions. One is a First Amendment issue, where an individual can choose to advocate on an issue as much as they want, and I support that, whether it's George Soros on the left or a conservative. But I do think that when you get to the realm of a politician who has the ability to do serious damage to your company or to your industry, and they're saying, give me money, it's far more like the squeegee guy with the brick than the guy asking to wash your window who, instead of a brick, maybe has a bucket with soap in it. So did you want to respond?
Yeah. But how do you distinguish between 500 citizens in California who get together and call themselves the Sierra Club and give Barbara Boxer $100,000 to put the coal industry out of business, and 100 coal industry executives who are going to, as you would put it, pay off some politician to kill Barbara Boxer's bill? I mean, it's one thing to talk about it, but if you're going to write a law that's going to prevent one, how do you prevent one without banning the other?
Well, in both of those instances, to me, the crucial distinction is, are those people in California, or are those, those executives writing those checks because, they're doing so voluntarily because they're expressing their views on something. I think that individuals have a right to do that. I think the question is whether people are put into a position where they basically have to. I recount in the book the example of Microsoft. I mean, I interviewed the guy who was the COO of Microsoft at the time. And the Justice Department went after Microsoft to break it up. And he told, and I recount some of it in the book, he told me where they basically sat down and people from both political parties said, hey, if you basically want this to go away, here's what you need to do. You need to hire these lobbyists, you need to start making these contributions, and this is not going to be a problem for you. That, to me, is not a voluntary exchange. That is an extortive exchange. And I would say that's different than, the guys who found Google who want to, protect, the desert in California and decide to take out ads and start doing so. I would categorize those as very different. Yes, sir. Sorry.
I'm a visitor from small country Croatia.
Yeah.
And the major problem with corruption in our country, with the grand or political corruption, is within executive branch of government.
Yes. Yes.
So you are mainly concentrated on the legislative branch of government.
Mm-hmm.
I intend to write on your book for Croatian, leading Croatian newspaper. So is your executive branch of government free of corruption or what?
That's a great question. No, I did focus a lot on Congress today. I actually do have a couple of chapters in the book on the executive branch, and particularly the Department of Justice, and which in recent years I think has become increasingly prone to a sort of selective prosecution. As it relates to certain actions. The example I give is something called the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, which was a bill signed in 1977. The bill is very broadly written, and it basically says that if you, as an American company, give anything of value to a foreign government official in the hopes of getting a contract, you will be criminally prosecuted, and it's a felony. And I mean, you can go to jail. And it's not only the person who actually does it. If some employee does it, a large corporation like Walmart hires some guy to help them, deal with government relations in Mexico, and that person ends up greasing some palms, the corporate executive, according to the law, can actually be held criminally liable even if he didn't know about it. If he should have known about it and didn't know about it, he can go to jail. Same thing applies to, corporate board of directors. So it's a very broad law. Well, Really, from 1977 up until 2009, both Democrat and Republican administrations, all attorney generals, there basically have been 3 prosecutions a year on average. It was just not really a law because people recognized the problems with it. In 2009, the Obama administration, Eric Holder and Lanny Brewer came in, and there were, that year alone, 150 different investigations. And when you look at who they're targeting, it's hard not to come to the conclusion that it's politically motivated. And you look at the timing of when they announced so-called industry sweep letters, where they said, we are now investigating the independent oil and gas sector. They send letters to people in that industry and say, if you're violating this law or think you are, you better let us know. And if you know of somebody else in the industry who's doing it, let us know. It's created a very real sort of fear, and I think that those prosecutions are politically motivated. And there's also statistical evidence that if you make campaign contributions and hire lobbyists, you dramatically reduce the penalties that you will face if they do actually go after you. So yes, it is a problem here in the executive branch, absolutely, just as well.
I'm almost older than dirt. And as a result, I become very cynical. I'm very distrustful of government. And the only way that I could see any hope at all is to have term limits. And that's unrealistic to expect out of this cronyism that we got going on. Unless, perhaps, we grandfather them and say, all right, you can stay as long as you can get reelected. But nobody else can stay longer than X years. And I don't know what that term should be. But isn't the biggest problem these guys, they just keep returning and returning and returning, and they build up a bigger power base. And unless we get term limits, you can kind of force out for our grandchildren this cronyism. I don't see any hope.
Yeah, you know, I was initially somewhat reluctant to support term limits because I thought, well, you're eliminating choices, and I'm a big believer in choices. But my attitude on term limits has changed because I think that it has become very much an industry. The industrial logic here in DC is very much towards longevity. It increases your opportunity for making money extraction. And there are studies that show the longer you stay, the more likely you are to embrace larger and larger government initiatives. The root problem to all of this is the size and scope of government. And that's something that I've had lots of conversations with people on all sorts of parts of the political spectrum. And I think everybody is willing to admit and agree to. It doesn't matter what kind of ethics system you set up, what kind of restrictions you put in place. If a politician has enough power to make or break a company or to make or break an industry, they're going to find ways to benefit financially and to have their family members benefit financially from their power. So it's the size and scope of government, I think, decentralizing, getting it to the state level. You're always going to have this problem with power and government, but if you decentralize it, you're going to still perhaps have corruption, but there are going to be a few less zeros at the end of the amount of money that we're talking about. So I would agree with you. I've come to the conclusion term limits are and that may be a creative way to get them to vote for it. So I like that.
Thank you. And do you have examples how politicians use like nonprofits or charities for the same purposes and like similar methods?
Yes, there are some examples. There's Congressman Clyburn from South Carolina has a charity that is they're sort of ostensibly to help young people, and he does a golf tournament. If you look at the largest contributors to his charity, they tend to be companies that fall under his regulatory control. And this is a problem. And one of the ironies that I point out in the book is that, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, under that law, there have been lots of American companies that have been prosecuted or charged on things that happen in Washington, D.C. all the time and that are perfectly acceptable. And one of them would be in Poland. You had a case where several large pharmaceutical companies, Schering, Plough, and others, made donations to legitimate charities in Poland, but a government minister, I think it was the health minister, was connected with that charity. And so they went after these companies that ended up paying hundreds of millions of dollars in fines to the U.S. federal government. So that is deemed to be a crime as it relates to foreign government officials. But here in Washington, D.C., if you are a congressman and you have a charity and you go to the people that you regulate and you have them make donations to your charity, somehow that's okay. So yes, that is a problem that exists. Another example I would give is the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. Right now, J.P. Morgan is being investigated by this administration because they have hired as interns the children of Chinese government officials. And that is deemed to be giving something of value to a Chinese government official. J.P. Morgan is apparently trying to get business, conduct business with the government there. And so they're possibly facing criminal charges. They will probably end up paying a fine for it. Well, you know, in D.C., I mean, you've got dozens of members of Congress who have family members who are lobbyists. And you know, when you look at the credentials of some of those individuals, they're lobbyists because of their last name and who their relative is. But that's common practice. So you can't hire a Chinese government official as an unpaid intern to work for J.P. Morgan. That will get you in criminal trouble in Beijing. But in Washington, you can hire the family member of a politician as a lobbyist and pay them a large fee, and that's okay. And that, I think, goes sort of the heart of the fact that, you know, politicians here write the rules, and they write the rules in ways that benefit them.
We have a final question?
I've seen the extortion. Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I think the extortion racket is at a very small scale too. You know, the whole so-called civil rights apparatus, fear of EEOC forces corporations to do all sorts of things all the times they don't want to.
Yeah.
You know, so I've faulted the CEOs of these companies because they could come out and blow the whistle on what's going on. And yeah, it would cause a stink, and they would have to step down. But they've got these golden parachutes. They're going to be fine. You know, I mean, it's really not a risk.
Yeah.
I think they're just afraid of looking like bad guys. I mean, I think it's just pure old-fashioned cowardice. Do you think that could play into this? That maybe more individuals stood up to this thuggery, could change it?
Oh, yes. I think if they would stand up to it, it would change it. I think the challenge is, and I'm certainly, you know, not going to generalize all of them, I think the challenge is that, you know, for a lot of these CEOs, they tend not to be that political to begin with. They tend to be focused on their business. They're committed to, you know, shareholder value. That's a lot of how they're compensated in terms of stocks. So, you know, if you start picking a fight with somebody, you know, the chairman of a powerful committee or the Senate majority leader, it can dramatically affect the price of your stock. And so they're thinking in those terms. You know, the CEOs that I interviewed, they said, look, the solution that a lot of CEOs do is they just give to both sides. Just max out, give to both sides. So you're basically protected. You know, it's like protection money. So I agree with you. I think part of it is perhaps with some of them, they don't want to look like bad guys. But I think a lot more of it is that they just have made the calculation that they'd rather, you know, pay the bribe. It's like the shop owner, and you know, and when the thugs come and say, you know, it's a dangerous neighborhood, you know, somebody could break this window, somebody could steal all your stuff, you know, you might want to hire us as security guards. A lot of guys end up just paying it because they're businessmen. They're not, you know, they're not in the practice of fighting thugs. So that's the sad reality. But yes, if they would stand up to it, I think we would see far, far less of it.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you, John. Appreciate it.
Such a cheery and optimistic message. I was thinking when you mentioned toll booths that, of course, you said timing was important on when some checks arrive. Timing is also very important, of course, in the joke world. But unfortunately, the joke's on us in this timing period. We do thank you again. This is a great companion to his previous book, Throw Them All Out. And if you have any trouble finding them, it won't be because of the lackluster color in its bright orange cover to alert you to it. We do have copies here if you would care to purchase, and I know Peter will be glad to sign them and talk with you further. Thank you again for coming to join us.